The afternoon sun hung low over Cleveland on November 14, 1977, making long shadows across the parking lot at Brainerd Place. The air had that special cold feeling that comes with late autumn in Northeast Ohio, sharp enough to make you pull your coat a little tighter, but not yet the deep bone cold of winter that was coming. In the parking lot, a green Cadillac sat waiting. Its Irish owner was inside, probably thinking about the dental appointment he just finished. Maybe he was thinking about other things too. The war he'd been fighting, the friends he'd lost, the enemies who wanted him dead. Next to that green Cadillac, another car waited, and inside that car, hidden beneath the frame, a bomb ticked silently. Connected to a remote detonator somewhere nearby, two men watched through binoculars, their fingers on a button that would end the most amazing story in American organized crime history. The explosion, when it came, was huge. The flash could be seen for blocks. The sound rolled across the neighborhood like thunder. Metal twisted and flew through the air, glass shattered. Fire bloomed orange and black against the gray Cleveland sky, and when the smoke cleared, Danny Greene, the Irishman, the Celtic warrior, the man who had survived 10 previous murder attempts without a scratch, was finally dead. But this wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of a legend, the end of a war, the end of an era in American organized crime. They called him indestructible. They called him crazy. They called him fearless. And his war with the Cleveland Mafia became the bloodiest mob conflict in American history, leaving a trail of bodies across the city and completely changing how law enforcement would fight organized crime forever. Tonight, you're going to hear the complete, unbelievable true story of the man who couldn't be killed until he was. Before we dive into this incredible tale, I want to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop your city and time in the comments below. If you love true crime stories and gangster history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Give this video a like if you're ready for one of the most fascinating mob stories ever told. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a cold Cleveland neighborhood in 1933. November 14th, 1933, while the rest of America struggled through the depths of the Great Depression, while Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was still finding its feet, while breadlines stretched around city blocks and hope seemed in short supply. In Cleveland, Ohio, a woman named Irene Greene went into labor. The delivery was difficult, complicated, the kind of childbirth that even in hospitals could go terribly wrong. And it did go wrong. Irene Greene died bringing her son into the world. The baby survived. They named him Daniel John Patrick Greene, a name heavy with Irish heritage, though he would later simply go by Danny. It was a difficult beginning for a life that would be defined by survival against impossible odds. The boy's father, John Greene, was a drunk. Not the functional kind who holds down a job and saves his drinking for after work. No, John Greene was the kind of alcoholic who couldn't raise a child, who could barely raise himself out of bed most mornings. He tried for a little while, or so the story goes. But a motherless infant and a bottle are difficult companions, and the bottle always won. So young Danny went to live with his grandfather on the city's east side in a neighborhood called Collinwood. If you don't know Cleveland, you need to understand what Collinwood was in the 1930s and 1940s. It wasn't a neighborhood, it was a statement. It was working-class Irish and Italian, with some Poles and Slovenians mixed in for good measure. It was steel mills and factories, corner bars and Catholic churches. Small houses pressed close together, where everyone knew everyone's business. It was the kind of place where boys grew up hard and fast, where you learned to use your fists before you learned algebra, where respect was earned with blood and kept with reputation. Danny's grandfather did his best. He was a stern man, old-world Irish, the kind who believed that hard work and harder discipline were the answers to life's problems. He put a roof over Danny's head and food in his belly. But warmth, affection, those were in short supply. The boy grew up knowing that his mother had died giving birth to him. A weight that some children carry their whole lives. A guilt that has no answer, no solution, no way to make it right. The neighborhood became Danny's real family. The streets became his classroom. And the lessons he learned there would shape everything that came after. Picture Collinwood in the 1940s. The houses are small, mostly wood frame, painted in colors that have long since faded under the assault of Cleveland's weather. The snow, the rain, the gray skies that seem to hang over the city for months at a time. Smoke from the steel mills drifts through the streets, giving everything a constant haze. Men walk to work in groups, lunch pails in hand, talking about the war in Europe, about Roosevelt, about the Indians' chances this year. Women hang laundry in backyards, gossip over fences. Watch the neighborhood children with eagle eyes, and those children. They run wild in the way that working-class kids did in those days. No organized sports leagues, no supervised playdates. No helicopter parents hovering over every moment. You went outside after school, and you came home when the street lights came on. And what happened in between was your business. You formed gangs. Not the kind with colors and guns and drug territories, but neighborhood crews, bands of boys who claimed certain blocks, certain playgrounds, certain corners as their own. Danny Greene was always big for his age. By the time he was 12, he was as tall as boys 3 or 4 years older. He was broad-shouldered, even then, with the kind of frame that promised he'd be a strong man once he finished growing. And he was tough, not mean necessarily, though he could be that too. But tough in the way that kids who grow up without softness become tough. He didn't start fights for fun, but he never backed down from one either. And in Collinwood, that reputation mattered. The neighborhood was divided along ethnic lines, though not as sharply as it would become in later years. The Irish kids hung together. The Italian kids had their own crews. Sometimes they got along, sometimes they didn't. And when they didn't, well, that's when fists flew and noses broke. And young Danny Greene learned that violence solved problems, at least in the short term. He wasn't a good student. School bored him. Sitting still bored him. The whole idea of reading books and doing homework when there was a world outside to explore and dominate, that didn't make sense to him. He skipped classes regularly, got in trouble constantly, drove his teachers to distraction, but he wasn't stupid. Far from it. Danny Greene had a sharp mind, a quick wit, and an ability to read people that would serve him well in years to come. He just didn't see the point in using those gifts for algebra and history lessons. What interested him was power, who had it, how they got it, how they kept it. Even as a boy, he was fascinated by the neighborhood tough guys. The men who walked with swagger, who commanded respect, who always seemed to have money in their pockets and fear in other men's eyes. Some of them were connected to the local rackets. Small-time stuff mostly, bookmaking, loan sharking. Maybe some stolen goods moving through the neighborhood. Nothing organized, not yet, but to a boy growing up without a father, without much of anything really, these men represented something. They represented possibility. By the time Danny Greene was a teenager, he was already dipping his toes into the criminal world. Nothing major, not at first, petty theft mostly. Stealing from stores, from unlocked cars, from anywhere that offered an opportunity and looked like an easy score. He was good at it too, quick hands, quicker feet, and a face that could look innocent when he needed it to. But petty crime wasn't what defined young Danny Greene. What defined him was his willingness to fight. In a neighborhood full of tough kids, he was one of the toughest. He didn't just win fights, he dominated them. There was a viciousness to his fighting that went beyond the normal teenage scuffling. A willingness to keep hitting long after his opponent was down. To make examples, to ensure that anyone who challenged him would remember it. Stories from this period paint a picture of a young man searching for identity, for belonging, for some way to make sense of a world that had taken his mother and given him nothing but hardship in return. The Irish heritage was there. You couldn't escape it in Collinwood. Couldn't ignore the sense that you belonged to something bigger than yourself. Some ancient tribe with its own history and pride and grievances. But Danny didn't fully embrace it yet. That would come later. For now, he was just a tough kid in a tough neighborhood, trying to survive and maybe get ahead. He dropped out of high school. No surprise there. School had never held his interest, and by 16 or 17, the idea of sitting in a classroom learning about things that had nothing to do with his life seemed ridiculous. He needed money. He needed purpose. He needed something more than what Collinwood could offer him in 1951. With the Korean War raging and the military desperate for men, Danny Greene joined the United States Marine Corps. He was 18 years old, full of energy and confidence, convinced that he was tougher than anyone else and eager to prove it. The Marines seemed like a perfect fit. An organization that valued toughness, that made warriors, that turned boys into men through discipline and violence. It didn't work out that way. The details of Danny Greene's time in the Marines are somewhat unclear. Military records from that era are incomplete, and Greene himself told different versions of the story over the years. What we know for certain is that he served, that he went through basic training, and that he was eventually discharged dishonorably. The reasons for the dishonorable discharge vary depending on who's telling the story. Some accounts say he went at WO repeatedly, unable to handle the rigid discipline and structure of military life. Others suggest he got into fights with fellow Marines, his temper and tendency toward violence making him unsuitable for service. Still others hint at more serious infractions, theft perhaps, or insubordination so severe that the Corps decided he was more trouble than he was worth. What's clear is that Danny Greene didn't find in the Marines what he was looking for. He didn't become the disciplined warrior, the honorable soldier, the man transformed by service to his country. Instead, he came home to Cleveland, more or less the same person he'd been when he left. Tough, volatile, always looking for an angle, always ready for a fight. But the Marine Corps did give him something, even if it wasn't what either party intended. It gave him a taste of structure, of hierarchy, of how organizations work. It showed him that power flows through systems, through chains of command, through loyalty and fear, and the careful management of both. These were lessons that would serve him well in the years to come, even if he learned them while failing as a Marine. Back in Cleveland in the early 1950s, Danny Greene needed work. He needed money. He needed a place where a man who was good with his fists and not afraid of anything could make his way in the world. And in Cleveland in those days, that place was the docks. The Port of Cleveland was a major shipping hub, handling cargo from the Great Lakes, connecting the industrial heartland to the rest of the world. And the men who worked those docks, the longshoremen, were a special breed. It was brutal work, physically demanding, dangerous. The kind of labor that broke men's bodies and killed them young. You loaded and unloaded ships in all weather, hauling cargo that weighed hundreds of pounds, working around cranes and hooks and heavy machinery that could crush you if you weren't careful. Men fell into holds and broke their backs. Men got caught between shifting cargo and were crushed. Men worked in freezing temperatures and blazing heat, their bodies wearing out long before their time. But the pay was good, union pay, better than most factory work. And there was a culture on the docks, a sense of brotherhood, of men doing hard work together and taking care of their own. The longshoremen had their own social clubs, their own bars, their own way of doing things. And like many industries dominated by immigrant labor, Irish, Italian, Polish, there was always an undercurrent of the rackets. Loan sharking for men who couldn't make it from paycheck to paycheck. Bookmaking for men who liked to bet on the horses or the fights. Protection rackets, kickbacks, a kind of low-level corruption that was just part of life. The grease that kept the wheels turning. Danny Greene took to the docks immediately. The physical labor didn't bother him. He was strong, he was young, and he liked the idea of being tougher than the next man. But more than the work itself, he understood the potential. He saw how the union operated, how certain men had power over others, how favors could be traded and debts collected and influence built. He saw that the Longshoremen's Union, the International Longshoremen's Association, or ILA, was more than just a labor organization. It was a power structure. And if you could climb that structure, you could have real authority, real money, real control over other men's lives. So Danny Greene set about climbing. The path to power in the ILA wasn't complicated. You needed to make yourself useful to the right people. You needed to show that you were tough enough to handle the rough stuff, smart enough to be trusted with money, and loyal enough not to talk when things went sideways. And you needed to be willing to do the things that other men weren't willing to do. Danny Greene was willing to do all of it. He started as an enforcer, the muscle, the guy who made sure that debts got paid, that people who borrowed money from the union's loan sharks paid it back with interest, that workers who caused trouble got straightened out. It was work that suited his temperament. He was big, he was intimidating, and he had a reputation for not just threatening violence, but following through with it. Men paid their debts when Danny Greene came collecting. Men shut their mouths when Danny Greene told them to. But he was more than just muscle, he was smart about it. He understood that violence was a tool, not an end in itself. You used it when you needed to, when it would send a message, when it would solve a problem. But you didn't use it recklessly, because that just made enemies and brought heat from the cops. Danny Greene learned to be strategic about his brutality, and that strategic thinking made him valuable to the men who ran the union. He also understood politics, not the kind with elections and campaigns, but the kind that matters in any organization where power is up for grabs. He cultivated relationships with the right people. He did favors. He kept his mouth shut when keeping his mouth shut was smart. And he spoke up when speaking up would make him look good. He positioned himself as someone who got things done, someone who could be relied upon, someone who deserved to move up the ladder. By the late 1950s, Danny Greene had become a significant figure on the docks. He wasn't running things yet, but he was close to those who did. He was making real money, not just from his longshoreman's wages, but from his various side activities, the kickbacks and payoffs and pieces of various schemes that came with being a union enforcer. He had a reputation throughout the waterfront as someone you didn't cross, someone who was going places. And then in 1961, Danny Greene became president of ILA Local 1317. At 28 years old, Danny Greene was now the head of his own union local. How exactly he achieved this position is a matter of some debate. The official story is that he was elected by the membership, that he ran on a platform of better wages and working conditions, that the rank-and-file longshoremen saw him as one of their own and voted him in. The reality was almost certainly more complicated. Union elections in those days, especially in industries with strong mob influence, were rarely clean affairs. Votes were bought, votes were forced. Opposition candidates were intimidated or paid off, and if all else failed, vote counts were simply changed to produce the desired result. Whether Danny Greene won his election honestly or through some combination of muscle and fraud doesn't really matter in the end. What matters is that he got the position, and once he had it, he used it. As president of Local 1317, Danny Greene had real power. He controlled hiring on the docks. Who got work and who didn't? Who got the good jobs and who got the bad jobs? Who made money and who struggled? That kind of power translated directly into money. Want to work the docks? You paid Danny Greene. Want a steady job instead of the day-to-day scramble? You paid Danny Greene. Want to avoid the most dangerous assignments? You paid Danny Greene. But Greene's ambitions went beyond simple shakedowns of longshoremen. He saw the Union presidency as a platform for bigger things. He began building relationships with Cleveland's organized crime figures, the men who controlled the real rackets in the city. He got involved in loan sharking operations, lending money at very high rates to workers who had nowhere else to turn. He expanded into other areas, vending machines, jukeboxes, anything where there was money to be made and where the Union's influence could provide protection. He also began to develop the persona that would define him for the rest of his life. He was Danny Greene, the tough Irish kid from Collinwood who had made something of himself. He was generous to those who were loyal to him, brutal to those who crossed him. He threw his weight around, made sure everyone knew who he was, walked with the swagger of a man who feared nothing and no one. For a few years it worked. The money rolled in. His reputation grew. He lived well, nice clothes, nice car, money to spend. He had a wife, had started a family, had achieved a version of the American dream, even if that dream was built on corruption and intimidation. But Danny Greene had a problem, several problems actually. First, he wasn't subtle. He was flashy, loud, obvious in his criminality in a way that made law enforcement take notice. Second, he was greedy. He didn't just skim a little off the top. He took everything he could get his hands on. And he didn't always share appropriately with the people who expected their cut. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he kept terrible records. That last one would prove to be his downfall. By the mid-1960s, the FBI was paying close attention to Danny Greene. The Bureau had been investigating corruption in the longshoremen's unions for years. And Greene's Local 1317 was so obviously crooked that it practically begged for investigation. Agents began building a case against him, documenting his various schemes, tracking the money, interviewing witnesses who were willing to talk. In 1966, the hammer fell. Danny Greene was charged on federal charges of embezzlement. The government claimed that he had stolen more than $11,000 from union funds, a significant sum in those days, equal to well over $100,000 in today's money. The evidence was damning. Greene had been sloppy, keeping records that made it clear where the money had gone. Unable to adequately explain the problems when questioned, he tried to fight it. He hired lawyers, claimed he was being targeted unfairly, argued that the accounting was simply confused rather than criminal. But the evidence was too strong. In the end, Danny Greene was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. It could have been the end of his story. Union president caught stealing, sent to prison, career over. Reduced to just another small-time crook who got too greedy and got caught. But for Danny Greene, prison wasn't an ending. It was an intermission, a time to reflect, to plan, to figure out what came next. Danny Greene served his time at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Lewisburg was no country club prison. It was a serious facility that housed serious criminals, many of them connected to organized crime. And for Greene, this was actually an opportunity. In prison, Greene met men who were deeper into the life than he had ever been. Real mobsters, men connected to major crime families, men who understood how the rackets really worked at the highest levels. He learned things. He made connections. He began to understand that everything he'd done on the docks was small time, that there was a much bigger world of organized crime out there, and that with the right approach, with the right attitude, there was real money to be made. He also began to embrace his Irish identity in a deeper way. In prison, identity matters. You align with your own people. You draw strength from ethnic and racial bonds. You find your tribe and you stick with them. For Danny Greene, that meant embracing his Irishness more fully than he ever had before. He read about Irish history, about the ancient Celtic warriors, about the centuries-long struggle against the English, about the mythology and the culture and the pride of being Irish. It spoke to him on a deep level. Here was a narrative that made sense of his life. He was a fighter, a warrior, a man who refused to bow to anyone. He was Irish. And the Irish had been fighting for their place in the world for centuries. He wasn't just Danny Greene. Small-time union crook, he was Danny Greene. Heir to a warrior tradition. A man who would bend knee to no one. This might seem like a small thing, but it wasn't. The identity that Danny Greene constructed for himself during his prison years would become central to everything that followed. It would shape how he presented himself to the world, how he operated, how he fought his enemies. The Celtic warrior wasn't just a nickname. It was a complete reimagining of who Danny Greene was and what he represented. Danny Greene was released from prison in 1968 after serving a little over 2 years of his sentence. He came home to a Cleveland that had changed during his absence. The city was struggling with the same problems that plagued many Rust Belt cities in the late 1960s. Racial tensions, economic decline, white flight to the suburbs, increasing crime. The old neighborhoods like Collinwood were deteriorating. The industrial base that had made Cleveland prosperous was beginning to erode. It was a city in transition, and not a good transition. Greene's own circumstances had also changed. His union presidency was gone, of course. Convicted felons don't get to run unions. His marriage was in trouble. Strained by his incarceration and by his own difficult personality. He was in his mid-30s now, no longer the young tough guy on the make, but not yet established enough to rest on his success. He needed to make money, and he needed to rebuild his reputation. So he went back to what he knew: muscle work, enforcement, the rackets. But this time he did it differently. This time he did it as Danny Greene, the Irishman, the Celtic warrior. He started dressing entirely in green pants, green shirts, green jacket. He drove a green car. He surrounded himself with Irish imagery and mythology. He talked about the ancient Celtic warriors, about their code of honor, about their fearlessness in battle. He claimed to be descended from Irish kings, though there was no evidence of this beyond his own claims. To many people, this seemed ridiculous. Grown men don't dress head to toe in green and talk about being Celtic warriors. But Danny Greene understood something important. Image matters, reputation matters. If you present yourself as something larger than life, if you commit to a persona completely, people start to believe it. They start to see you the way you want to be seen. And in the criminal underworld, where fear and respect are currencies more valuable than cash, being seen as something special, something dangerous, something other than just another thug, that had real value. Greene also formed his own organization. He called it the Celtic Club. And while it wasn't exactly a gang in the traditional sense, it functioned as his crew. These were the men who worked for him, who carried out his orders, who helped him run his various schemes. And those schemes were diverse. He got into the garbage hauling business, using muscle to force legitimate companies to hire him or face consequences. He ran protection rackets, demanding money from businesses in exchange for keeping them safe from the very violence he would inflict if they didn't pay. He got involved in vending machines, in loan sharking, in anything and everything where there was money to be made. But here's the thing about Danny Greene's operations. They were loud, they were obvious. He didn't operate in the shadows like most criminals. He was public about who he was and what he did. He gave interviews to newspapers. He talked openly about his criminal activities, always carefully avoiding direct confessions, but making it clear that he was a man to be reckoned with. He cultivated a Robin Hood image, the tough guy who helped his Irish community, who fought against the powerful, who stood up for the little guy, even while extorting money from them. It was all nonsense, of course. Danny Greene was no hero. He was a criminal, a violent man who hurt people and stole money and built his empire on fear and intimidation. But the image worked. People in the Irish neighborhoods saw him as one of their own who had made it. who commanded respect, who didn't bow down to anyone, especially not to the Italian Mafia that ran most of Cleveland's organized crime. And that brings us to the conflict that would define the rest of Danny Greene's life and ultimately lead to his death. His war with the Cleveland Mafia. To understand Danny Greene's story, you need to understand the Cleveland Mafia in the 1960s and 1970s. The Cleveland crime family, sometimes called the Cleveland Syndicate, was one of the most powerful organized crime organizations in America. It wasn't as famous as the Five Families in New York or the Chicago Outfit, but it was wealthy, it was well connected, and it controlled significant rackets throughout Northeast Ohio. The family's roots went back to the Prohibition era when Italian immigrants in Cleveland's Little Italy neighborhood began organizing bootlegging operations. Over the decades, they expanded into gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and various legitimate businesses that served as fronts for their criminal activities. By the 1960s, the Cleveland family was bringing in millions of dollars a year with operations not just in Ohio, but throughout the Midwest. The family operated under a traditional mafia structure. There was a boss at the top, an underboss beneath him, captains who ran different crews, and soldiers who carried out the actual work. There were rules, the famous Mafia Code or Omerta, the laws about making your bones before you could be a made man, the prohibition against dealing drugs, which they all violated anyway, the requirement to show respect to bosses and to kick up money to those above you in the hierarchy. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Cleveland family was in transition. The old bosses who had built the organization were dying off or retiring. Younger men were jockeying for position. There were internal tensions about how the family should operate, about who should be in charge, about how to deal with the changing landscape of organized crime in America. And into this environment came Danny Greene, an Irish loudmouth who was operating on their turf without permission, who was refusing to pay tribute, who was acting like he was untouchable. The Mafia didn't like Danny Greene. They didn't like his attitude, his refusal to show proper respect, his insistence on operating independently in their world. You worked for the family or you didn't work at all. You paid your tribute. You followed the rules. You knew your place. And if you didn't, well, that's what bullets were for. But Danny Greene didn't care what the Mafia liked or didn't like. He saw them as just another gang, one he could compete with and maybe even beat. He saw their ethnic tribalism and raised them his own. They were Italians, he was Irish. They had their Cosa Nostra, he had his Celtic heritage. They had their code of silence. He had his code of the warrior. It was a romantic, probably delusional way of looking at things. The Mafia was a sophisticated, wealthy criminal enterprise with decades of experience and connections throughout the country. Danny Greene was one guy with a crew of maybe a dozen men and a lot of swagger. By all rights, the Mafia should have crushed him immediately. They tried, oh how they tried, before we get to the all-out war. We need to talk about Alex Shonder Burns, because Burns was the bridge between Danny Greene's early independent operations and his eventual full-scale conflict with the Mafia. Alex Burns was a Cleveland mobster, though not an Italian one. He was Jewish, which meant he could never be a made man in the Mafia. But he worked closely with the Cleveland family for decades. Burns had been around since the bootlegging days. And by the 1960s, he was a wealthy, powerful figure in Cleveland's underworld. He ran various rackets, numbers, loan sharking, prostitution. He was connected, respected, dangerous, and for a time, he was Danny Greene's partner. The exact nature of their relationship is somewhat unclear, as these things often are in the criminal world, where everything is based on handshakes and unspoken agreements rather than written contracts. But basically, Burns took Greene under his wing in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He helped Greene establish his operations, gave him protection. showed him how things really worked at the higher levels of organized crime. Why would Burns do this? Partly because Greene was useful, he was tough, he had his own crew, and he could handle muscle work that Burns needed done. But also because Burns saw in Greene something of his own younger self. A scrappy outsider who refused to be pushed around by the Italian Mafia, who carved out his own space through sheer force of will. For a few years, the partnership worked. Greene and Burns collaborated on various schemes. Greene used Burns' connections and protection to expand his operations. Burns used Greene's muscle to handle problems and enforce collections. It should have been a beautiful friendship, but Danny Greene was not someone who did well with partners for long. He chafed at having to share profits with Burns. He disliked having to defer to anyone, even someone who had helped him, and as his own power grew, he began to see Burns not as a mentor and partner, but as an obstacle. Someone who was taking money that should rightfully be his. The relationship soured. Exactly how and why depends on whose account you believe. But the basic story is that Greene and Burns had a falling out over money and territory. Greene wanted more independence. Burns wanted more respect and a bigger cut. Neither was willing to give an inch. And then in 1975, Alex Burns was killed. Someone planted a bomb in his car, and when Burns got in and started the engine, the explosion tore him apart. It was a professional hit. The kind of thing that sends a message. This is what happens to people we want dead. The Cleveland Mafia was immediately suspected, and there's evidence that they were indeed involved. But there's also evidence, circumstantial but compelling, that Danny Greene had a hand in it as well. Whether he actually ordered the hit or just took advantage of the Mafia's decision to eliminate Burns, the effect was the same. One of Cleveland's most powerful independent operators was dead, and Danny Greene moved quickly to take over his operations. This was a turning point. With Burns gone, Greene was no longer just a tough guy running protection rackets in Irish neighborhoods. He was a major player in Cleveland's underworld, controlling significant territory and income. And he had proven that he was willing and able to go up against powerful people and win. The Mafia took notice, and they didn't like what they saw. We also need to talk about John Nardy, because Nardy would become Danny Greene's most important ally in the war that was coming. John Nardy was different from most of the people in this story. He was Italian, which meant he could have been a made member of the Cleveland Mafia if he'd wanted to be. He had the connections, he had the criminal background, he had the ethnic credentials, but Nardy had a problem. He was too independent, too ambitious, too unwilling to bow and scrape before the family bosses. Nardy had been a union official like Greene. He had come up through labor racketeering, and he had strong connections throughout Cleveland's underworld. He ran his own crews, controlled his own rackets, and made good money. But he was on the outside looking in at the Cleveland family's real power structure. And it frustrated him when Danny Greene emerged as a significant independent operator. Nardy saw an opportunity. Here was someone else who refused to submit to the Mafia. Someone who was tough enough to stand up to them. Someone who could be an ally in challenging the family's dominance. The fact that Greene was Irish and Nardy was Italian didn't matter. What mattered was that they both wanted what the other had. Legitimacy, territory, money, power. So Nardy and Greene formed an alliance. It was, on the surface, an unlikely partnership. Greene was flashy, loud, public. Nardy was quieter, more calculating, more strategic. Greene was motivated partly by ego and his own mythology. Nardy was motivated by practical ambition. But they shared a common enemy, and in the criminal underworld, that's often enough. Together, Greene and Nardy represented a real threat to the Cleveland Mafia. They controlled significant operations. They had loyal crews, they had money, and they had the will to fight. And fight they would in a conflict that would turn Cleveland streets into a war zone. The war between Danny Greene and the Cleveland Mafia didn't start with a formal declaration. There was no meeting where one side challenged the other. No moment when someone drew a line in the sand and dared the opposition to cross it. Instead, it started the way these things usually start, with tensions and threats and small acts of violence that gradually escalated until people started dying. The exact timeline of the early bombing attempts on Danny Greene is difficult to establish with precision. Records from that era are incomplete, newspaper accounts sometimes conflict, and the survivors who could tell the story often had reasons to lie or exaggerate. But we know that someone, almost certainly people connected to the Cleveland Mafia, began trying to kill Danny Greene in the early 1970s. And we know that impossibly, they kept failing. The first attempt might have been the bombing of Greene's apartment in 1971. He was living in a building in Collinwood, not far from where he grew up, in a neighborhood he still considered his territory. Someone, and we'll probably never know exactly who, planted a bomb in or near his apartment. The explosion was massive, destroying much of the building, blowing out windows, causing structural damage that would take months to repair. Danny Greene walked away without a scratch. He wasn't even home when the bomb went off. Pure luck, pure chance, pure providence, whatever you want to call it, he survived. And when he showed up at the scene later, as firefighters were still putting out flames and police were trying to figure out what had happened, he stood there in his green clothes and smiled. He told reporters that someone was obviously trying to kill him, but they'd have to do better than that. He said he wasn't afraid, wasn't going to hide, wasn't going to change how he operated. It was pure Danny Greene, defiant, theatrical. Feeding his own legend, the Mafia tried again and again and again. There was the car bomb that failed to detonate properly, leaving Greene's green Cadillac damaged but the man himself unharmed. There was the ambush outside a restaurant where gunmen opened fire and somehow missed, bullets ricocheting off buildings while Greene dove for cover and then returned fire with his own gun. There was another apartment bombing, this one even more powerful than the first. That again went off when Greene wasn't home. With each failed attempt, Danny Greene's reputation grew. People started calling him indestructible, the Irishman who couldn't be killed, the man with 9 lives. Some people whispered that he was protected by supernatural forces, that his Celtic warrior ancestors were watching over him, that God himself had decided Danny Greene's time hadn't come yet. Greene encouraged these stories. He leaned into the mythology, talking about his Irish heritage, about destiny, about how he was meant for something greater than dying in some cowardly ambush. He wore a Celtic cross around his neck, a large gold pendant that caught the light and drew the eye. He quoted Irish poetry. He invoked the names of Irish heroes from history and legend. It was all part of the persona, the image, the brand. But here's the thing, it was working. Every time he survived another attempt on his life, his power grew, his reputation grew. Men wanted to work for him because he seemed protected. Blessed, untouchable, enemies feared him for the same reasons. And the more the Mafia tried to kill him and failed, the more weak and incompetent they looked. This was psychological warfare as much as physical warfare. And Danny Greene understood that better than his enemies did. But while Danny Greene was surviving assassination attempt after assassination attempt, not everyone around him was so lucky. The war between Greene's organization and the Cleveland Mafia was producing bodies at an alarming rate. Cleveland in the mid-1970s became one of the most dangerous cities in America for people involved in organized crime. Bombings were happening regularly, not just attempts on major figures like Greene, but bombings of businesses, of cars, of homes. Some were warnings. Some were murders, some were just chaos, violence for the sake of violence. One side trying to terrorize the other into submission. The newspapers called it Bomb City between 1975 and 1977. There were more than 30 bombings in the Cleveland area connected to mob violence. The Cleveland Police Department's bomb squad was overwhelmed. They'd investigate one bombing, gather evidence, try to figure out who was responsible, and before they could make any progress, another bomb would go off somewhere else, and it wasn't just bombings. There were shootings, stabbings, beatings, people disappearing and never being found. The violence was spreading beyond the immediate participants. Associates were being killed. Family members were being threatened, innocent people, or at least people who weren't directly involved in the conflict, were getting caught in the crossfire. The Cleveland Mafia was used to violence. They'd been killing people for decades, going back to the Prohibition Wars of the 1920s and 1930s. But this was different. This was open warfare, sustained and bloody, with bodies piling up faster than either side could count them. And it was all because one stubborn Irishman refused to back down, refused to show proper respect, refused to acknowledge that he couldn't win, except that by any reasonable measure. Danny Greene was winning. He was still alive. His operations were still running. He was still making money. He had survived multiple assassination attempts that should have killed him. His reputation was at an all-time high. Meanwhile, the Mafia was taking losses. Soldiers killed, operations disrupted, heat from law enforcement intensifying. They were supposed to be the powerful established organization. He was supposed to be the upstart who got put in his place. But that's not how it was playing out. The Mafia bosses were getting desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. Danny Greene wasn't just playing defense. He was hitting back, and hitting back hard. For every attempt on his life, Greene retaliated. Sometimes he targeted the specific people he believed were responsible. Sometimes he went after associates, businesses, anyone connected to his enemies. He was fighting a guerrilla war, striking when and where he could, keeping his opponents off balance, making them understand that trying to kill him came with a price. He bombed businesses owned by Mafia figures. He sent his crew to intimidate and assault their associates. He targeted their income streams, their operations, anything that would hurt them. And he did it publicly, making sure everyone knew that Danny Greene was responsible, that the Irish were fighting back against the Italians, that this wasn't just a criminal conflict but an ethnic war. That last part, the ethnic angle, was calculated. Greene understood that framing the conflict as Irish versus Italian gave him something the Mafia couldn't match. The Mafia was powerful, but they were also despised by many people in Cleveland's Irish community, seen as outsiders, as criminals, as the enemy. By positioning himself as an Irish warrior fighting against Italian oppression, Greene tapped into decades, even centuries, of ethnic tension and resentment. It was brilliant propaganda, even if it had little to do with the reality of what was happening. The reality was that two groups of criminals were fighting over money and power. But the story Greene told was about heritage, about pride, about standing up for your people against those who would push you down. That story resonated. It brought him support, recruits, protection from a community that might otherwise have wanted nothing to do with a violent criminal. Greene also cultivated relationships with the media. He gave interviews regularly, always careful not to confess to anything specific, but making it clear who he was and what he represented. He positioned himself as a colorful character, a throwback to a more romantic era of crime, the tough guy who lived by a code and didn't hide what he was. Reporters loved him. He made great copy, the green clothing, the Irish mythology, the brazen defiance of the Mafia, the miraculous survivals. They wrote profile after profile, turning Danny Greene into something of a folk hero, at least to readers who didn't have to live with the reality of the violence he was inflicting. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was increasingly frustrated. They knew Danny Greene was a criminal. They knew he was involved in everything from extortion to murder. But proving it was difficult. Greene was smart enough not to directly implicate himself. He had loyal people who wouldn't talk. He operated through layers of insulation, giving orders but never being present when those orders were carried out. And even when the police could build a case, getting convictions was hard. Witnesses were intimidated or bought off. Evidence disappeared. Juries were reluctant to convict someone who seemed larger than life, who was fighting the mafia, who had this reputation for being indestructible. So Danny Greene continued operating, continued fighting, continued surviving. But the clock was ticking. By 1976, the war had been going on for several years, and both sides were feeling the strain. For the Cleveland Mafia, the conflict with Danny Greene had become an existential threat. They weren't just losing face, they were losing money, losing soldiers, losing control of their own operations. Bosses in other cities were asking questions. Why couldn't Cleveland handle one Irish upstart? What kind of family lets an outsider operate on their territory with impunity? There were also increasing concerns about law enforcement. The FBI had always monitored the Cleveland Mafia, but the bombing campaign and the body count were drawing unprecedented attention. Federal agents were investigating, building cases, pressuring informants. The violence was making it harder for the Mafia to operate their legitimate businesses. Banks and legitimate partners were distancing themselves. It was getting expensive, dangerous, unsustainable. Something had to give. The Cleveland Mafia's leadership changed during this period. James "Jack White" Licavoli became the boss of the Cleveland family in 1976. Licavoli was old school, a traditionalist who believed in the Mafia code and the importance of respect and hierarchy. He was also ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to maintain the family's power and reputation. And he was absolutely determined to kill Danny Greene. Licavoli understood that Greene had to die, not just because of the money or the territory, but because as long as Danny Greene was alive, the Cleveland Mafia looked weak. Every day that Greene walked around in his green clothes, giving interviews, surviving assassination attempts, was another day that the family's reputation suffered. So Licavoli made killing Danny Greene the organization's top priority. He allocated resources, brought in outside help, told his soldiers that nothing mattered more than ending the Irishman's life. Money was no object, collateral damage was acceptable. They would do whatever it took. Danny Greene, for his part, knew the pressure was intensifying. He knew that his luck couldn't hold forever, that eventually someone would get him, but he refused to change his behavior. He refused to hide, refused to leave Cleveland, refused to dial back his operations or make peace with his enemies. That wasn't who he was. It wasn't the Celtic warrior persona he'd created. He told people that he would die before he'd bow to the Mafia. He said that if death came for him, he'd meet it on his feet fighting. He talked about destiny and fate and how a man couldn't run from what was meant to be. It was romantic in a way, tragic certainly, and incredibly foolish, but it was Danny Greene through and through. Defiant to the end, unwilling to compromise, committed to his own mythology, even if that mythology would kill him. John Nardy, Greene's ally in the war against the Cleveland Mafia, was also feeling the pressure. Nardy had always been more practical than Greene, more willing to think strategically about how to win rather than just how to fight. And by 1976, he was starting to wonder if they could actually win. The Mafia had more men, more money, more connections. They had staying power that Greene and Nardy's coalition didn't have. Yes, Greene had survived multiple assassination attempts. And yes, they'd inflicted damage on the Mafia. But they hadn't broken them. They hadn't forced them to surrender or negotiate. All they'd done was ensure that the war would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. Nardy began to explore the possibility of making peace. He put out feelers, used intermediaries to suggest that maybe they could reach an agreement. Maybe there was a way for everyone to walk away from this, to divide up the city's rackets in a way that everyone could live with, to end the violence before more people died. Danny Greene was having none of it. He refused to negotiate, refused to compromise. refused to even consider the possibility of peace. As far as he was concerned, this was a fight to the finish. Either he would beat the Mafia or he would die trying. There was no middle ground. This put Nardy in a difficult position. He was allied with Greene. But Greene's stubbornness was making it impossible to find a way out. Nardy began to wonder if staying with Greene was worth the risk. If maybe he should try to cut his own deal with the Mafia. Save himself even if Greene wouldn't save himself. We'll never know if Nardy actually tried to separate himself from Greene. If he attempted to make his own peace with the Mafia. Because before he could do anything, the Mafia made the decision for him. The mid-1970s bombing campaign in Cleveland represented something unprecedented in American organized crime. There had been mob wars before, Prohibition-era gang wars. The Castellammarese War in New York, various conflicts in Chicago and other cities. But those had generally involved shootings. Ambushes, the traditional tools of criminal violence. What was happening in Cleveland was different. The extensive use of car bombs and explosives made it feel less like a mob war and more like urban terrorism. And the technology involved was sophisticated, far beyond the simple dynamite bombs that criminals had used in earlier eras. The bomb makers in this war were professionals. They used plastic explosives, electronic detonators, remote controls. Some bombs were triggered by the ignition, turn the key, complete the circuit. Detonate the explosive, others were on timers, set to go off at a specific time when the target was expected to be present. Still others were remotely detonated, with someone watching from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to push the button. The Cleveland Police Department's bomb squad was learning on the job. Trying to keep up with increasingly sophisticated devices, they'd investigate a bombing scene, piece together how the bomb had been constructed, brief officers on what to look for. And then the bombers would adapt, change their methods, introduce new wrinkles that made detection harder. For ordinary Cleveland residents, it was terrifying. The bombings weren't confined to isolated areas or late-night hours when streets were empty. They happened in shopping centers, in residential neighborhoods. In broad daylight, cars exploded in parking lots. Buildings were damaged, windows shattered blocks away from blast sites. The local news covered each bombing extensively, showing the wreckage, interviewing witnesses who described the flash and the sound and the chaos. People in Cleveland started checking under their cars before starting them, even if they had no connection to organized crime. The fear was spreading beyond the actual participants in the war. And through it all, Danny Greene continued to survive. Another car bomb that he discovered before it detonated. Another ambush that he somehow avoided. Another attempt that failed through bad luck, poor planning, or what Greene himself would have called divine intervention. Each survival added to the legend. News coverage would show the wreckage of a car that had been meant to kill Greene. And there would be Greene himself, alive and defiant, talking about his enemy's incompetence, promising payback, wearing his green clothes like a uniform that declared who he was and what he represented. Frustrated by their inability to kill Danny Greene through conventional means, the Cleveland Mafia made a decision that would eventually prove to be their undoing. They brought in outside help. Ray Ferrito was a professional hitman with connections to mob families in several cities. He was good at his job, patient, careful, willing to wait for the perfect opportunity rather than rushing into something and making mistakes. The Cleveland family had used him before for various jobs, and he had a reputation for getting things done. In 1976 and 1977, Ferrito was essentially put on retainer to kill Danny Greene. His job was simple: study Greene's movements, identify vulnerabilities, figure out how to get past his defenses, and end his life. Money was no object. Take whatever time you need, just get it done. Ferrito began surveillance. He followed Greene, noted his patterns. identified the places he went regularly. He looked for opportunities. Moments when Greene would be exposed, when security would be lax, when a bomb or a shooting would have the best chance of success. But Danny Greene was a hard target. He varied his routes. He was constantly watchful, always watching for potential threats. He traveled with associates who were armed and willing to fight. He had friends throughout his old neighborhood who would warn him if they saw anything suspicious. Ferrito tried several approaches. He considered a long-range rifle shot, but couldn't get a good line of sight when Greene was stationary enough. He considered a car bomb, but needed to know which car Greene would be driving and when. He considered a direct assault, but knew that would likely result in a gunfight where the outcome was uncertain. What Ferrito needed was a moment when Greene would be predictable, when he would have to be in a specific place at a specific time, when the circumstances would allow for a precise remote detonated bomb that would ensure his death. That opportunity would eventually come, but before it did, the Cleveland Mafia would lose one of their own targets in the most spectacular way possible. On May 17, 1977, John Nardy walked out of the Teamsters Union office on East 22nd Street in Cleveland. It was early afternoon, a Tuesday, a normal working day. Nardy had been meeting with union officials. He still maintained his connections in the labor movement, still used his union position as a base for his various criminal operations. He walked to his car, a red Oldsmobile parked on the street near the union building. It was a nice spring day, warm, but not too hot. The kind of weather that makes you glad to be alive. Nardy probably wasn't thinking about bombs or assassins. He'd survived this long by being careful, by being smart, by not taking unnecessary risks. And this was just a walk to his car in broad daylight on a busy street. He got in the driver's seat, put his key in the ignition, turned it. The explosion was massive, so powerful that it threw debris for hundreds of feet. The car was essentially vaporized, reduced to twisted metal and scattered parts. John Nardy died instantly, his body torn apart by the blast. The street was littered with wreckage. Buildings nearby had windows blown out. Witnesses blocks away heard the explosion and felt the ground shake. The Cleveland Mafia had finally gotten one of their targets. Nardy's death sent a clear message to Danny Greene. You're next, your partner is dead, your luck is running out. It's only a matter of time, and Greene knew it. He told people after Nardy's assassination that he understood what was coming, that the Mafia would keep trying until they got him too, but he refused to change his behavior. He still drove around Cleveland in his green car. He still went to his usual places. He still dressed in green and gave interviews and acted like the indestructible Irishman. Maybe he believed his own mythology. Maybe he thought that if he'd survived 10 or 11 assassination attempts, he could survive the next one too. Maybe he was just stubborn, unwilling to let fear dictate his actions. Or maybe, on some level, he'd accepted that he was going to die and decided that he'd rather die on his own terms, living as he always had, than die hiding in fear. Whatever his reasoning, Danny Greene continued his routines, and Ray Ferrito continued his surveillance, watching, waiting, looking for that perfect opportunity. The summer and fall of 1977 were strange times for Danny Greene. He knew the Mafia was coming for him. Everyone knew. The bombing that killed John Nardy made it clear that the Cleveland family had refined their techniques, that they were willing to strike in broad daylight, that they had the capability to kill even careful, paranoid men who took precautions. Greene did make some adjustments. He varied his schedule more. He was more careful about checking his car for bombs. He traveled with armed associates more consistently. But these were modest changes, not the kind of dramatic security overhaul that might have actually kept him safe. He also seemed to be preparing for his own death in odd ways. He talked more about legacy, about what he would be remembered for. He gave more interviews, as if he wanted to make sure his version of his story was out there before someone else could tell it differently. He made comments about dying young, about how warriors don't die in bed, about how he'd rather burn out than fade away, to the people around him. It was clear that Greene understood his time was limited, but he couldn't or wouldn't do what was necessary to survive. Leave Cleveland, make peace with the Mafia, dramatically change his lifestyle. That wasn't who Danny Greene was. The Celtic warrior didn't run. The Irishman didn't bow to Italians. The man who had survived 10 assassination attempts didn't start hiding because there might be an 11th. He continued running his operations. The garbage hauling, the vending machines, the protection rackets. Money was still coming in. He still had a crew. He was still a power in Cleveland's underworld. For all the violence, for all the attempts on his life, Danny Greene was still standing, still operating, still making money, and that, more than anything else, was what signed his death warrant. As long as he was alive and functioning, the Cleveland Mafia looked weak. They'd been trying to kill him for years and had failed. Every day he survived was another day they were embarrassed. They couldn't let it stand. They couldn't give up. They had to keep trying until they finally got him. As autumn turned toward winter, Ray Ferrito intensified his surveillance of Danny Greene. He'd been watching for months, noting patterns, looking for that perfect opportunity, and he was starting to see one. Greene had regular dental appointments. He went to a dentist in Lyndhurst, a suburb east of Cleveland. The appointments were scheduled in advance, which meant Ferrito could know when Greene would be there. The dental office was in a building with a parking lot, which meant Ferrito could potentially plant a bomb in a car parked near where Greene would park. It wasn't a perfect setup. There were variables, things that could go wrong, but it was better than anything else Ferrito had found. And the Cleveland Mafia was getting increasingly insistent that something had to happen soon. Ferrito brought in help. Ronald the Crab Carabia was a Cleveland mobster, an experienced criminal who could be trusted to help with the technical aspects of the assassination. Together, they began planning the hit. They would plant a bomb in a car in the dental office parking lot. They would park it next to where Greene typically parked. They'd observed his pattern enough to know he usually chose spots in the same general area. They would use a remote detonator, which meant they could wait until Greene was actually next to the car before triggering the explosion. This would minimize the chance that Greene would spot the bomb, would ensure he was in the kill zone when it detonated, would give them control over the exact moment of the attack. The date they chose, whether by random chance or by cruel design, was November 14th, 1977, Danny Greene's 44th birthday. Danny Greene woke up on his birthday morning, probably not thinking that it would be his last day alive. He'd survived so many attempts, so many close calls, so many moments when he should have died but didn't. Why would this day be any different? He went through his morning routine, got dressed in green, of course always green. Maybe he had breakfast, maybe he talked to associates about business. Maybe he thought about what being 44 years old meant, how his life had turned out, what still lay ahead. He had a dental appointment that afternoon, 2 o'clock, at the Brainerd Place office building in Lyndhurst, a routine appointment, the kind of thing that doesn't register as particularly important or dangerous. You go to the dentist, you get your teeth cleaned or a cavity filled, you go home. Not the kind of event that requires elaborate security precautions. But Ray Ferrito and Ronald Carabia were already in position. They'd planted their bomb the night before. A powerful explosive hidden in a car parked in the lot where they expected Greene to park. They'd done their homework, studied the layout, identified the best spot for the explosive vehicle. Now they waited, watching through binoculars from a nearby location. The remote detonator ready, the afternoon was cool but clear. The kind of November day where the sun is out but provides little warmth, where you can see your breath but don't need gloves yet. Danny Greene arrived at the dental office in his green Cadillac, driving himself, no bodyguards visible. Though he may have had associates nearby, he parked in his usual area of the lot, got out of his car, probably locked it, though that seems almost comically irrelevant given what was about to happen. Walked into the building for his appointment. Ferrito and Carabia watched, confirmed it was Greene. Confirmed he'd parked next to their car bomb. Now they just had to wait for him to come out. Danny Greene's dental appointment was routine. A cleaning maybe, or a minor procedure, nothing complicated. He probably chatted with the dentist or the hygienist, maybe joked around. Maybe talked about the weather or sports or whatever people talk about at dental appointments when they're trying to distract themselves from what's being done to their teeth. He had no idea that two men with binoculars were watching the parking lot. Waiting for him to return to his car, Danny Greene walked out of the building around 2:30 p.m. The appointment had gone fine, just another errand completed. Another mundane task checked off the list. He walked across the parking lot toward his green Cadillac. Ray Ferrito watched through binoculars, waited for the perfect moment. Waited until Greene was next to his car, until he was in the kill zone, until there was no possibility of survival. And then he pressed the button. The explosion was devastating. The car bomb detonated with tremendous force, creating a blast wave that radiated outward at supersonic speeds. Danny Greene, standing next to his car directly adjacent to the bomb vehicle, took the full force of the explosion. The blast threw his body across the parking lot. Shrapnel, metal fragments from the car, nuts and bolts added to the bomb to increase its lethality, tore through him. The heat from the explosion burned everything within the immediate blast radius. The sound was deafening, rolling across the neighborhood like thunder. When the smoke cleared, Danny Greene was dead. His body lay in the parking lot, broken and burned. The green clothes he'd worn like a uniform, now stained with blood and charred by fire. The man who had survived 10 or 11 previous assassination attempts, who had walked away from explosions and shootings and ambushes, who had seemed indestructible, untouchable, blessed by luck or fate or the Celtic gods he claimed as his ancestors. That man was finally definitively dead. The parking lot was chaos. The bomb car was destroyed, reduced to burning wreckage. Greene's Cadillac was heavily damaged. Windows in the nearby building were shattered. Debris covered the pavement. People were screaming, running, trying to figure out what had just happened. Someone called 911. Police and ambulances arrived within minutes. They secured the scene, checked for other bombs, began investigating. They found Danny Greene's body and knew immediately who it was. The green clothing was a giveaway, and Greene's face, though damaged, was recognizable. Detectives arrived, FBI agents arrived. The Cleveland bomb squad arrived. Everyone knew this was significant, that this wasn't just another mob hit. Danny Greene's death would have consequences, would change things, would mark the end of something, and maybe the beginning of something else. But for now, in that parking lot on a cool November afternoon, the only immediate reality was that Danny Greene, the Irishman, the Celtic warrior, the man who couldn't be killed, was dead at 44, killed on his birthday, finally caught by the violence that he'd lived with for so long. Ray Ferrito and Ronald Carabia left their observation post immediately after the explosion. They'd seen the blast, seen the destruction, knew they'd succeeded. No need to stick around and risk being spotted or caught. They drove away calmly, carefully, not speeding, not drawing attention to themselves. They met with their Cleveland Mafia contacts, confirmed the kill, collected their payment. The contract was fulfilled. Danny Greene was dead after years of trying, after so many failed attempts, after so much money and time and effort. The Cleveland family had finally eliminated their most troublesome enemy. There was celebration in the Mafia social clubs that night. Drinks were raised to Ray Ferrito, to Ronald Carabia, to everyone who had contributed to finally ending Danny Greene's life. The war was over. They'd won. The Irish upstart who'd refused to show proper respect, who'd fought them to a standstill, who'd embarrassed them for years, he was gone, dead, finished. They could go back to business as usual. They could rebuild their operations, reclaim the territory Greene had controlled, restore their reputation. The nightmare was over, except it wasn't. Because Danny Greene's death didn't end the story, in many ways. It was just the beginning of the end for the Cleveland Mafia itself. The Cleveland Police Department and the FBI both began investigating Danny Greene's assassination immediately. This wasn't just another mob hit. This was the culmination of years of violence. The end of a war that had turned Cleveland into Bomb City. The death of someone who, despite being the criminal, had become something of a public figure. The investigation had several advantages that investigations of previous bombings hadn't had. First, witnesses had seen suspicious activity in the parking lot. A car that had been parked there overnight. Men who seemed to be watching the building. Second, the bomb itself left forensic evidence. Fragments of the detonator, components that could be traced. A signature to the construction that bomb technicians could analyze. Third, and most importantly, the FBI had been building a massive case against the Cleveland Mafia for years. And they had informants, wiretaps, and surveillance that could help identify who was responsible. Within days, investigators had developed leads. They'd identified Ray Ferrito as a suspect. They'd connected him to Ronald Carabia. They'd begun tracing the conspiracy back through the Cleveland Mafia's hierarchy, identifying who had ordered the hit, who had funded it, who had provided support. The Cleveland Mafia thought Danny Greene's death was the end of their problems. Instead, it was the beginning of the biggest law enforcement operation against organized crime in Cleveland's history. The FBI had been investigating the Cleveland Mafia for years, but Danny Greene's assassination gave them the catalyst they needed to move from investigation to prosecution. The Bureau launched what it called Mobster, an acronym for mob strike. Though the name didn't really make sense. The operation was the most comprehensive attack on organized crime that Cleveland had ever seen. The FBI had multiple advantages. First, they had years of surveillance, wiretaps, and informant reports documenting the Cleveland family's activities. Second, the bombing campaign had been so brazen, so public, so well documented that building cases was easier than it might otherwise have been. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the fear that had kept people silent was starting to crack, with Danny Greene dead. With the FBI making it clear they were serious about taking down the entire Cleveland Mafia. People who had been too scared to talk began cooperating. Ray Ferrito was arrested in late 1977, facing a potential death sentence for Greene's murder. He made a decision that would have been unthinkable in an earlier era of organized crime. He flipped. He became a government witness, agreeing to testify against his co-conspirators in exchange for a lighter sentence. Ferrito's cooperation was devastating to the Cleveland Mafia. He could describe in detail how the assassination was planned, who ordered it, who helped, who knew about it. His testimony would be the foundation for multiple prosecutions, including cases against some of the highest-ranking members of the Cleveland family. Ronald Carabia was also arrested and eventually convicted. James Licavoli, the boss of the Cleveland family, was charged for ordering Greene's murder. Other captains and soldiers were charged with various crimes connected to the bombing campaign and other criminal activities. The prosecutions took years. There were trials, appeals, more trials, but one by one, the Cleveland Mafia's leadership was convicted and sent to prison. The organization that had dominated Cleveland's underworld for decades was being systematically dismantled by federal prosecutors. The impact of the mobster operation went far beyond just the prosecutions related to Danny Greene's murder. The FBI used the momentum from those cases to pursue the Cleveland Mafia on multiple fronts. Gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, extortion. Every criminal enterprise the family ran was targeted. Every source of income was attacked. The families in other cities watched with a mixture of concern and relief. Concern because the Cleveland cases showed that the FBI had gotten much better at prosecuting organized crime, that informants were willing to break omerta, that the old ways of doing business were increasingly dangerous. Relief because it was Cleveland's problem, not theirs. But the truth was that Cleveland was a preview of what was coming for organized crime across America. The FBI's success in dismantling the Cleveland family would be replicated in other cities. The use of RICO statutes, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, to prosecute entire criminal organizations rather than just individual crimes would become standard practice. The era when the Mafia operated with relative impunity was ending. By the early 1980s, the Cleveland Mafia was a shadow of its former self. Most of its leadership was in prison. Its operations were disrupted. New leadership tried to rebuild. But law enforcement pressure was constant. The organization never fully recovered from the damage done by the bombing war with Danny Greene and the prosecutions that followed. In a strange way, Danny Greene had won. Not by defeating the Mafia in battle, they'd killed him after all, but by forcing them into a war so visible, so violent, so public that it ultimately destroyed them. His death was the beginning of their end. The trials of Ray Ferrito, Ronald Carabia, James Licavoli, and others connected to Danny Greene's murder stretched across several years and provided the public with a detailed look at how the assassination had been planned and executed. Ferrito's testimony was particularly dramatic. Here was a professional hitman, a man who had killed before and would have killed again, describing in clinical detail how he'd watched Danny Greene, how he'd planned the bombing, how he'd waited in the parking lot with his finger on the detonator, waiting for the perfect moment to kill a man he'd never met and had nothing personal against. It was business, a contract, a job. The defense attorneys tried various strategies. They attacked Ferrito's credibility, pointing out that he was a murderer who'd made a deal to save his own skin, that his testimony was bought and paid for with leniency. They argued that the physical evidence was circumstantial, that their clients were being targeted because of their Italian heritage, that this was persecution rather than prosecution. None of it worked. The evidence was too strong, the testimony too detailed, the pattern too clear. Jury after jury came back with guilty verdicts. Judges handed down long sentences. 20 years, 30 years, life in prison. James Licavoli, the Cleveland Mafia boss who had made killing Danny Greene his top priority, was convicted and sentenced to 17 years in federal prison. He died in prison in 1985. A broken man who'd watched his organization collapse around him. Ronald Carabia was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He served 36 years before being paroled in 2002. An old man returning to a world that had changed completely during his incarceration. Ray Ferrito, despite his cooperation, still received a significant sentence. He was killed in prison in 1981, stabbed to death by another inmate. Whether it was mob revenge for his testimony or for unrelated reasons, no one knows for certain. The trials revealed something else. The sheer scope of corruption that had enabled the Cleveland Mafia to operate for so long. Police officers who'd taken payoffs, union officials who collaborated with racketeers, business owners who paid protection money and never reported it. The Cleveland Mafia hadn't operated in isolation. It had widespread cooperation, complicity from supposedly legitimate segments of society. The revelations damaged Cleveland's reputation and forced a reckoning about how organized crime had been allowed to flourish for so long. Reform movements swept through police departments and city government. New leadership promised to clean up corruption. Whether they succeeded is debatable, but at least the conversation was happening. Danny Greene's story didn't end with his death or with the trials that followed. He became a legend, a folk figure, the subject of books and documentaries, and eventually a Hollywood film. The 2011 movie Kill the Irishman, starring Ray Stevenson as Danny Greene, introduced his story to a national audience. The film took liberties with the facts, as Hollywood always does, but it captured something essential about who Greene was. The swagger, the defiance, the ethnic pride. The refusal to back down even when backing down was the only sensible option. Books about Greene and the Cleveland Mafia war became bestsellers. Rick Porrello's To Kill the Irishman is considered the definitive account. Meticulously researched and compellingly written. It doesn't glorify Greene. Porrello is clear about the violence, the criminality, the lives destroyed, but it also captures why Greene's story is so fascinating. In Cleveland itself, particularly in the old Irish neighborhoods, Danny Greene remained a controversial figure. To some, he was a hero. The Irish guy who stood up to the Italian Mafia, who refused to be pushed around, who fought for his people and his heritage. Never mind that he was a criminal who extorted money from those same people. Never mind that his war brought violence and death to their neighborhoods. The mythology was more appealing than the reality. To others, Greene was a cautionary tale. A man whose pride and stubbornness led to his own death and the deaths of many others. Whose criminal activities brought shame to the Irish community. Whose legacy was blood and destruction rather than anything worth celebrating. Both views have some truth to them. Danny Greene was complicated, contradictory, not easily categorized as hero or villain. He was a product of his environment, shaped by poverty and abandonment and the brutal streets of mid-20th century Cleveland. He was also a violent criminal who made choices, who hurt people, who built his empire on fear and intimidation. So why, nearly 50 years after his death, do we still tell Danny Greene's story? Why does it fascinate us? Part of it is the sheer audacity of what he did. One man, not part of a powerful family, not connected to a national crime syndicate. Just one stubborn Irish guy from Cleveland. Took on the Mafia and fought them to a standstill for years. He survived attempts on his life that should have killed him for years. He operated successfully in territory the Mafia considered their own. That's inherently compelling, the underdog story. The individual against the institution. Part of it is the theatricality. The green clothing, the Celtic imagery, the public persona. Greene understood branding before branding was a thing. He created a character, a role, and he played it to perfection. He gave the media great quotes, presented himself as larger than life, turned his criminal career into performance art. Part of it is the violence. We're drawn to stories of danger and death, to the question of how and when someone will die, to the tension of knowing that each day could be their last. Greene's story has that in abundance. The constant threat, the miraculous survivals, the inevitable tragic ending, and part of it, perhaps the most important part, is the mythology of the Irish warrior. Greene tapped into something deep in the American Irish psyche. The memory of oppression, the pride in fighting back, the celebration of those who refused to submit. He framed his criminal career as ethnic warfare, Irish versus Italian. The underdog refusing to bow to the establishment. That narrative resonated in the 1970s, and it still resonates today. But we should also remember what Danny Greene really was. A criminal, a violent man who hurt people. Someone whose war destroyed lives and families and communities. The mythology is seductive, but it shouldn't obscure the reality. Danny Greene's war with the Cleveland Mafia and the law enforcement response that followed had implications far beyond Cleveland. It represented a turning point in how America dealt with organized crime. The extensive use of bombs in the Cleveland War prompted changes in how law enforcement handled explosives cases. Bomb squads became better trained, better equipped, more capable of investigating sophisticated devices. Techniques developed in Cleveland were shared with other departments across the country. The FBI's mobster operation demonstrated that RICO statutes could be devastatingly effective against organized crime families. By prosecuting the organization rather than just individual crimes, by showing patterns of racketeering, by using testimony from cooperating witnesses, federal prosecutors could dismantle entire criminal enterprises. This approach would be replicated in New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and other cities with strong mafia presence. The willingness of people like Ray Ferrito to break omerta and testify was also significant. The mafia's code of silence had been one of its greatest strengths. Members went to prison rather than cooperate, maintained loyalty even when facing life sentences. But the Danny Greene case showed that the code could be broken, that the right pressure could turn mobsters into witnesses. This realization changed how the FBI approached organized crime investigations. By the 1980s and 1990s, the American Mafia was in retreat across the country. The combination of RICO prosecutions, cooperating witnesses, improved law enforcement techniques, and changing social conditions was breaking the power of organizations that had dominated American crime for generations. Cleveland was one of the first dominoes to fall, and Danny Greene's war was a significant part of that story. Not everyone involved in the Cleveland Mafia war died or went to prison. Some survived, faded into obscurity, lived out their lives in relative peace. Some of Danny Greene's former associates went straight, got legitimate jobs, tried to leave their criminal pasts behind. Others continued in the life, but at lower levels, staying away from anything that might attract attention, avoiding the mistakes that had brought down their predecessors. The Cleveland Mafia still technically exists, though it's a fraction of what it once was. A handful of elderly members, some younger associates, running small-time rackets and trying to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. They're not major players anymore, not even significant figures in Cleveland's criminal landscape. They're remnants, echoes of an organization that once held real power. The neighborhoods where Danny Greene operated have changed. Collinwood isn't what it was in the 1930s and 1940s. The ethnic divisions have shifted, demographics have changed. The old social clubs and corner bars have closed or transformed into something different. The Cleveland that produced Danny Greene doesn't quite exist anymore. But the stories remain. Old-timers still talk about the bombing war, about the day Danny Greene died, about who was there and who did what, and how it all went down. Some of these stories are accurate, some have been embellished over the years. Details added or changed, mythology overtaking history. But they're told and retold, passed down, kept alive. What can we take from Danny Greene's story, beyond just the fascination with crime and violence? There's a lesson about pride and stubbornness, about how refusing to back down can be admirable but also fatal. Greene could have made peace with the Mafia. He could have left Cleveland. He could have dialed back his operations and avoided direct conflict. Any of these choices might have kept him alive, but they would have required him to compromise, to submit, to acknowledge that there were forces more powerful than himself. And Danny Greene couldn't do that. His pride, his commitment to his own mythology, his refusal to show fear or weakness, was what made him compelling. It was also what killed him. There's a lesson about the relationship between violence and power. Greene built his reputation and his empire through violence, through the willingness to hurt people who crossed him. But violence is unstable. It escalates. It creates enemies who will eventually respond with their own violence. Greene survived many attempts on his life, but the odds were always against him. Eventually, someone was going to get lucky, going to plan better, going to catch him at the right moment. Violence as a tool has diminishing returns. There's a lesson about mythology and reality. Danny Greene created a persona, the Celtic warrior, the indestructible Irishman, that served him well for years. It intimidated enemies, attracted followers, gave him power beyond what his actual resources justified. But mythology isn't armor. It doesn't stop bullets or prevent bombs from exploding. In the end, Danny Greene was just a man, vulnerable in all the ways that men are vulnerable. The mythology couldn't save him, and there's a lesson about consequences. Greene's war with the Mafia didn't just affect him and his enemies. It affected innocent people, families of those who were killed, residents of neighborhoods where bombs exploded, workers whose businesses were caught up in the violence. The bombing campaign terrorized an entire city, and when it was over, when Greene was dead and the Mafia was being prosecuted, the damage remained. Families were broken, communities were traumatized. The cost was far higher than any individual criminal's fate. Most of the people directly involved in the story are dead now. Ray Ferrito, killed in prison. James Licavoli, died in prison. Ronald Carabia, released and died years later. The detectives who investigated the case, the prosecutors who tried it, the witnesses who testified. Most are gone, but the story remains. It gets told and retold, adapted and reinterpreted. Used to make different points by different people with different agendas. Danny Greene is a folk hero. Danny Greene is a cautionary tale. Danny Greene is proof that one person can make a difference. Danny Greene is proof that violence ultimately destroys those who live by it. All of these interpretations have some validity. The truth is complicated, as truth usually is, behind the mythology, behind the Celtic warrior persona, behind the green clothes and the brazen defiance and the miraculous survivals. Who was Danny Greene really? He was a boy who lost his mother at birth and grew up without the love and stability that children need. He was a teenager searching for identity and belonging in the tough streets of Collinwood. He was a young man who found that violence and intimidation could give him power and respect that legitimate paths never would. He was a union official who discovered that corruption was profitable. He was a criminal who built his empire through fear and who died because other criminals feared him. He was also intelligent, charismatic, capable of genuine loyalty to those he considered friends. He could be generous. There are stories of Greene helping people in his neighborhood, paying for funerals, assisting families in need. Of course, he was helping them with money he'd extorted from others. So perhaps the generosity was less impressive than it seemed. But people who knew him personally often spoke of his positive qualities alongside acknowledgement of his crimes. He was a man who created himself, who decided who he wanted to be and became that through sheer force of will. The Irish heritage was real, but the Celtic warrior persona was constructed, deliberately crafted to serve his purposes. He understood the power of image, of mythology, of giving people a story they could believe in. He was brave, genuinely, legitimately brave. You can be a criminal and still have courage, and Greene had that in abundance. Facing death repeatedly and continuing to walk the streets in green clothing. Refusing to hide, refusing to back down. That takes a kind of courage that most people don't possess. But he was also foolish. Bravery without wisdom is just recklessness. He could have survived if he'd been willing to compromise, to adapt, to recognize when stubbornness becomes suicide. He chose his mythology over his life, and in doing so, he guaranteed that his story would end tragically. The parking lot at Brainerd Place where Danny Greene died still exists. It's been repaved multiple times since 1977. The building has been renovated. The cars that were destroyed in the blast are long ago towed away and scrapped. There's no marker, no plaque. Nothing to indicate that this was the site of one of the most significant mob hits in American history. Life goes on. People park there every day, go to their appointments, run their errands, completely unaware that they're walking across ground where a man died violently, where a war ended, where history happened. That's probably appropriate. Danny Greene isn't someone who deserves a monument or memorial. He was a criminal, a violent man who caused tremendous pain and suffering. The fact that his story is compelling doesn't make him a hero. But standing in that parking lot today, knowing what happened there, it's impossible not to feel something. The weight of history, the tragedy of wasted potential, the stark reality of violence, that for all of Greene's mythology and survival and defiance, he ended his life torn apart by a bomb, his body broken on the pavement. 44 years old and dead on his birthday. Danny Greene's story raises a question that we might not want to answer. Why are we fascinated by criminals? Why do we tell their stories, make movies about them, turn them into legends and folk heroes? Part of it is simply that crime stories are dramatic. They have conflict, violence, tension, unpredictable outcomes. They're inherently more interesting than stories about people following the rules and living conventional lives. Part of it is vicarious thrill. Most of us will never live outside the law. We'll never experience the kind of danger and intensity that criminals face. Hearing their stories lets us imagine what that life would be like without actually having to risk anything. Part of it is the mythology of the outlaw, the person who rejects society's rules, who lives by their own code, who refuses to submit to authority. There's something appealing about that, especially in American culture with its emphasis on individualism and self-reliance. But we need to be careful about romanticizing criminals. Danny Greene wasn't Robin Hood. He wasn't a freedom fighter. He was a man who hurt people for money, who built his empire on fear and violence, whose war terrorized an entire city. The fact that he was interesting, that he created a compelling persona, that his story has drama and tension, none of that changes the fundamental reality of what he was. We can tell his story, we can acknowledge why it's fascinating, but we should also remember the victims, the people who suffered because of the violence Greene and his enemies inflicted. We should remember that behind the mythology were real human beings whose lives were destroyed. In researching Danny Greene's story, I came across an interview with an FBI agent who worked on the Mobster investigation. He'd been there when Greene died, had helped investigate the bombing, had worked on building the cases against the Cleveland Mafia. What struck me most was his mixed feelings about Greene. On one hand, the agent acknowledged that Greene was a criminal who deserved to be prosecuted, who had committed serious crimes, who wasn't someone to admire. On the other hand, he expressed a grudging respect for Greene's courage, his refusal to be intimidated, his willingness to stand up to the Mafia even when it was clearly going to get him killed. He knew they were coming for him, the agent said. He knew he was living on borrowed time, but he wouldn't hide, wouldn't run, wouldn't back down. You have to respect that, even if you can't approve of anything else he did. This captures the essential paradox of Danny Greene. He was simultaneously admirable and despicable, brave and foolish, a man worthy of respect and a man who destroyed lives. Human beings are complicated, and criminals are human beings too, capable of both nobility and evil, sometimes simultaneously. We'll never know what Danny Greene was thinking in the seconds before the bomb exploded. Was he thinking about his dental appointment? About some business matter? About what he'd have for dinner? Was he thinking about the war? About the enemies who wanted him dead? About the possibility that today might be the day his luck ran out? Did he have any warning? Any sense that something was wrong? Did he see anything suspicious in that parking lot? Any hint that death was waiting? Or did it come without warning? Just a flash and a sound and then nothing? We'll never know. Danny Greene's last thoughts died with him in that parking lot on November 14th, 1977. What we do know is that he lived life on his own terms, right up until the moment those terms ran out. He was Danny Greene, the Irishman, the Celtic warrior, the man who couldn't be killed until he was. He fought his war, survived as long as his extraordinary luck held, and died the way warriors are supposed to die, according to the mythology he created for himself. Suddenly, violently, while still active and still defiant. If you believe in that kind of romanticism, it's a good death, a fitting end to a legendary life. If you don't believe in romanticism, if you see Danny Greene as he actually was, rather than as he presented himself, then his death is just sad, a waste of a life that could have been something better. The inevitable conclusion to a path chosen years earlier when he decided that violence and crime were the answers to his problems. Both views are valid. Both capture something true about Danny Greene. In the years since Danny Greene's death, his legend has only grown. Time has a way of smoothing down the rough edges of criminal stories, removing the immediate pain and suffering of their victims, and leaving only the dramatic narrative. Danny Greene has become, in many retellings, almost a sympathetic figure, the underdog who stood up to the powerful mafia, the Irishman who refused to submit to Italian dominance, the colorful character who brought drama and excitement to gray industrial Cleveland. This mythologizing isn't unique to Greene. American culture has a long history of turning criminals into folk heroes. Jesse James, Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Al Capone. We remember the audacity, the charisma, the dramatic confrontations. We forget the victims, the ruined lives, the communities terrorized by violence. But the myth of Danny Greene is particularly persistent because it plays into several powerful narratives. The ethnic struggle, Irish versus Italian, minority against majority, the outsider refusing to accept his prescribed place, the individual against the system, one man challenging a powerful criminal organization and holding his own for years. The warrior mythology, the Celtic fighter who lived by a code and died with his boots on, facing his enemies rather than running. These are compelling stories. They speak to something deep in us. This idea that one person can make a difference, that courage and will can overcome superior force, that it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees. The fact that Danny Greene was a criminal becomes almost secondary to the larger narrative of resistance and defiance. Beyond the mythology, what was the real impact of Danny Greene and his war with the Cleveland Mafia? The most obvious impact was the destruction of the Cleveland Mafia as a major criminal organization. The combination of the bombing war and the subsequent prosecutions effectively broke the family's power. They never recovered. Cleveland went from being one of the Mafia's strongest cities to being essentially irrelevant in terms of organized crime. That's a direct result of the war Danny Greene forced on them. Whether this was a good thing depends on your perspective. The Cleveland Mafia was replaced by other criminal organizations. Street gangs, drug dealers, various other groups that filled the power vacuum. Organized crime didn't disappear from Cleveland. It just changed form. Some would argue that the decentralized, chaotic criminal landscape that replaced the Mafia was actually worse. More violent, harder to police. The bombing campaign itself left deep scars on Cleveland. For years, people were afraid to start their cars, checked under their vehicles before driving, lived with a constant awareness that extreme violence could erupt anywhere at any time. That kind of fear changes communities, makes people less trusting, less willing to engage with their neighbors, more willing to look the other way when they see something suspicious. The publicity from the war also damaged Cleveland's reputation nationally. Bomb City wasn't exactly a nickname that attracted investment or tourism. The image of Cleveland as a violent mob-controlled city persisted long after the actual violence had ended. Perception matters, and the perception of Cleveland was shaped significantly by the Greene Mafia War. On the positive side, the law enforcement response to the bombing campaign did improve police capabilities, strengthen federal cooperation with local agencies, and demonstrate that even powerful criminal organizations could be taken down with sufficient will and resources. These were valuable lessons that have had lasting impact on how America deals with organized crime. The Cleveland case became a template for how federal law enforcement would approach organized crime throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The techniques developed or refined in the Mobster investigation. Extensive use of wiretaps, leveraging RICO statutes. Flipping witnesses with offers of reduced sentences. Building conspiracy cases that targeted entire organizations. All of these became standard practice. The FBI looked at Cleveland and realized that the old mafia families were vulnerable in ways they hadn't been before. The code of omerta could be broken. High-ranking members would cooperate to save themselves. If you applied enough pressure, offered the right incentives, showed that you were serious about destroying entire organizations rather than just prosecuting individual crimes, you could win. This realization led to a concerted federal effort against the mafia across the country. The Commission case in New York, which prosecuted the bosses of all 5 families simultaneously. The Boston cases that destroyed the Patriarca family. The Chicago cases, the Philadelphia cases everywhere. The pattern was similar: intensive investigation. RICO prosecutions, cooperating witnesses. Long prison sentences for leadership by the late 1990s. The American Mafia was a shadow of what it had been in its glory, days of the 1950s through 1970s. Much of that decline can be traced back to the techniques and approach that were proven effective in Cleveland during the aftermath of Danny Greene's death. Did Danny Greene intend any of this? Of course not. He was fighting for his own power, his own money, his own ego. He wasn't trying to bring down organized crime in America. But his war forced the Cleveland Mafia into action so brazen, so public, so violent that law enforcement had to respond aggressively. And that response changed everything. Let's not lose sight of the human cost of Danny Greene's war with the Cleveland Mafia. The numbers vary depending on the source, but conservatively, at least 30 people died as a direct result of the bombing campaign and associated violence between 1975 and 1977. 30 people, mobsters, yes, but also people with families, children, parents who mourned them, and that's just the deaths. There were also people maimed by bomb blasts, people traumatized by witnessing violence, children who grew up in neighborhoods turned into war zones, families destroyed by the imprisonment of fathers and husbands, businesses ruined by extortion or bombing. Danny Greene's widow and children had to live with his legacy. His associates who survived the war had to find new ways to make a living, often carrying criminal records that made legitimate employment difficult. The families of men killed by Greene's organization. They got no justice, no closure, just absence and grief. The communities where the violence occurred, Collinwood, Little Italy. The various Cleveland neighborhoods where bombs exploded and bodies were found. They carried the trauma for years. Property values declined. People moved away if they could. Those who remained lived with the memory of what had happened, with the knowledge that their streets had been battlegrounds. This is what gets lost in the mythology. When we celebrate Danny Greene as some kind of folk hero, when we admire his courage and his defiance, we're implicitly minimizing the real suffering his actions caused. He wasn't a freedom fighter. He wasn't standing up for the oppressed. He was a criminal fighting other criminals for control of criminal enterprises. And innocent people paid the price. It's worth asking. What would have happened if Danny Greene had survived? If Ray Ferrito's bomb had failed like all the others? If Greene had continued his charmed existence? If the war had dragged on? How would it have ended? One possibility is that the Cleveland Mafia would have eventually given up. The cost of fighting Greene was enormous: money, men, attention from law enforcement, damage to their reputation at some point. The practical move would have been to negotiate a truce, divide up Cleveland's criminal territory, find a way to coexist. Greene might have ended up as a recognized independent operator, running his rackets with mafia acceptance if not approval. Another possibility is that Greene would have eventually been killed by someone else. If not the mafia, then a rival from within his own organization, or law enforcement in a shootout, or just random violence. Men who live by the gun tend to die by the gun. And Greene had plenty of enemies beyond just the Mafia. A third possibility is that Greene would have been arrested and prosecuted. The FBI was certainly interested in him. If he'd continued operating, continued building his criminal empire, eventually law enforcement would have built a case strong enough to put him away. And unlike the embezzlement charge that sent him to prison in the 1960s, this time he would have been facing serious time for serious crimes. None of these scenarios end well for Danny Greene, even his best case outcome. Making peace with the Mafia and continuing his operations would have eventually led to arrest or assassination. His lifestyle was unsustainable. His refusal to operate in the shadows made him too visible. His enemies were too numerous and too determined, one way or another. Danny Greene was always going to die young or go to prison for life. The bombing just accelerated the inevitable. Danny Greene's story forces us to think about violence and its place in human society. We're fascinated by violent men, by warriors and soldiers and criminals who live by different rules than the rest of us. We make movies about them, write books about them, celebrate their courage and daring, even when we know intellectually that what they're doing is wrong. Why? What is it about violence that draws us in? Part of it is evolutionary. We're descended from people who had to fight to survive. Violence was an essential skill for most of human history. We're wired to pay attention to threats, to respect those who can protect us or harm us, to be fascinated by conflict. Part of it is social. We live in societies that are mostly peaceful, mostly safe, mostly governed by laws that prevent the kind of personal violence that was common in earlier eras. So we experience violence vicariously through stories, getting the thrill without the actual danger. But there's something deeper too. Violence is decisive. It cuts through complexity and ambiguity. In a fight, there's a winner and a loser, a clear outcome. In a world where most of our problems are complicated and most of our conflicts resist simple solutions, there's something appealing about the clarity of violence. Danny Greene understood this. He used violence not just as a tool, but as a form of communication, a way of making statements that couldn't be ignored or misinterpreted. When he bombed a business or shot someone, he was sending a message: I am serious, I am dangerous, I will hurt you if you cross me. These were messages that couldn't be delivered through conversation or negotiation. They required violence, but violence has consequences that go beyond the immediate winners and losers. It creates cycles of retaliation. It traumatizes communities. It normalizes brutality and makes peaceful resolution of conflicts less likely. Danny Greene's violence didn't just hurt his immediate targets. It hurt everyone in Cleveland who had to live with the fear and chaos of the bombing campaign. Understanding Danny Greene requires understanding both the appeal of violence and its costs. He was successful for years because he was good at violence, willing to use it when others hesitated, capable of escalating when necessary. But he ultimately died because violence is unstable, because it creates enemies who respond with their own violence, because no one is invincible. Throughout this story, I've tried to explain how Danny Greene became who he was. The motherless childhood, the rough neighborhood, the lack of opportunities, the culture of violence he grew up in. These factors certainly shaped him, made him more likely to choose the path he chose. But we should be careful about removing responsibility from criminals. Danny Greene made choices. He chose violence over peace. He chose crime over legitimate work. He chose to build an empire on fear and extortion rather than finding another way to live. Yes, his circumstances made those choices more likely. Yes, he faced obstacles that people from more privileged backgrounds don't face. But other people grew up in Collinwood. Other people lost parents young. Other people struggled with poverty and lack of opportunity. And they didn't become violent criminals. They found other paths, other ways of dealing with their pain and frustration and desire for something better. Danny Greene is responsible for what Danny Greene did. We can understand him without excusing him. We can acknowledge the factors that shaped him without removing his moral responsibility for his actions. This matters because how we think about criminals affects how we think about crime. If criminals are just products of their environment, victims of circumstances beyond their control, then the solution to crime is purely social. Fix the environment, and you fix the crime. But if criminals are people who make choices, who bear responsibility for their actions, then individual accountability matters too. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. Danny Greene was shaped by his circumstances, but he also made choices. Understanding this complexity is important if we want to have honest conversations about crime, punishment, and justice. In the end, Danny Greene represents something larger than just one criminal story. He represents the American dream twisted into nightmare. The self-made man who builds his empire through violence rather than enterprise. The success story that destroys rather than creates. The ethnic pride that becomes ethnic warfare. He represents the mythology of masculinity that celebrates violence and stubbornness as virtues. The man who never backs down. Who faces death without fear. Who refuses to submit. It's a mythology that gets men killed, that destroys families, that perpetuates cycles of violence. But it's also deeply embedded in our culture, particularly in working-class communities where physical toughness is still valued and respected. He represents the outlaw tradition in American culture, a person who rejects society's rules and lives by their own code. From cowboys to gangsters to rebels of all kinds, America has always had a complicated relationship with outlaws, simultaneously condemning them and celebrating them, recognizing their wrong but admiring their independence. He represents the ethnic tensions that have shaped American cities. Irish versus Italian, minority against majority. The struggle for respect and recognition and power. These tensions have faded but haven't disappeared. And Greene's story reminds us how violent they could become when mixed with criminal ambition. Most of all, Danny Greene represents the power of mythology, of image, of the stories we tell ourselves and others about who we are. He created a persona, the Celtic warrior, the indestructible Irishman, and committed to it so completely that it became real in a sense. People believed the myth because he believed it. And that belief had real power, real consequences. But mythology isn't truth, and in the end, the truth caught up with Danny Greene in a parking lot on his 44th birthday, when a bomb blast reminded everyone that beneath the green clothing and the Irish crosses and the warrior talk, he was just a man, vulnerable and mortal like everyone else. So what's the final assessment of Danny Greene? How should we remember him? As a criminal, certainly, a violent man who built his power through fear and intimidation, who extorted money from working people, who killed or ordered killed anyone who stood in his way. That's not in dispute. As a courageous man, whatever else you can say about Danny Greene, he wasn't a coward. He faced danger repeatedly and didn't flinch. He could have run, could have hidden, could have made peace with his enemies. He chose to stand and fight instead. That takes a kind of courage that deserves acknowledgement, even if we condemn how he used that courage. As a complicated figure who can't be reduced to simple hero or villain. He hurt people and helped people. He was loyal and ruthless. He was intelligent and foolish. He was shaped by circumstances beyond his control and made choices for which he was responsible. Human beings contain multitudes, and Danny Greene contained more multitudes than most. As a symbol of a particular time and place in American history, the bombing war he fought was a product of 1970s urban America. The declining industrial cities, the ethnic neighborhoods, the powerful but aging mafia families, the cultural changes sweeping the country. His story couldn't have happened in any other era. It emerged from specific historical circumstances and tells us something about that moment in time. As a cautionary tale about pride, stubbornness, and the ultimate futility of violence. Danny Greene could have lived. He could have backed down, made peace, found another way. His insistence on fighting to the end, his refusal to compromise, his commitment to his own mythology. These things killed him as surely as Ray Ferrito's bomb did. And finally, as a genuinely fascinating character whose story compels us to think about violence, ethnicity, masculinity, criminal justice, and the nature of heroism and villainy in American life. Good storytelling complicates rather than simplifies, raises questions rather than providing easy answers. Danny Greene's story does that, and that's the complete story of Danny Greene, the man who survived everything until he didn't. A street kid from Cleveland who became a legend, fought the mafia to a standstill, and changed organized crime in America forever. What do you think? Was Danny Greene brave or reckless, a hero or a criminal? Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this deep dive into mob history. Make sure you're subscribed because I have more incredible true crime stories coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Sleep well if you can after hearing this tale.